Good evening and welcome to Frontline Access of Maccabi Canada. Tonight we've got a very special guest for you. I will be welcoming in David Goldstein, the author of Aliyah to Aliyah, the story of African-American hoopsters in the Holy Land. Before we bring David in, note that Alan Dershowitz, the great Alan Dershowitz, has called this book a remarkable story that transcends sports, race, and even Israeli history. It's a story about humanity, grit, and teamwork, an inspiring read for everyone. Without further ado, here's David Goldstein. Good evening, David.
Good evening, Daniel. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate the opportunity.
So let's jump right into it. The first story for readers in this book, you're in an old folks' home, you're visiting your grandparents, and they're talking about Anthony Parker. An unusual place to get inspiration to write this book, so tell us about that.
Yeah, it certainly was. So this was way back in May 2007. I was visiting Israel, as I frequently do. My mom's Israeli, and my mom's side of the family all lives in Israel. Was visiting my grandparents in Nofei Yerushalayim. It's an assisted living complex in Jerusalem where they lived. And my grandmother had some friends over. We were chatting actually about anything but basketball to start with. It was a very typical conversation. Nothing out of the ordinary. And then I mentioned being from Toronto, and suddenly the tenor of the conversation shifted and these women just lit up. And suddenly these elderly Eastern European Jewish women heard Toronto and said, "Oh, Toronto, Anthony Parker." And Anthony Parker, as your viewers would likely know, was a Toronto Raptor at the time. But he'd also played 5 years for Maccabi Tel Aviv, and he'd won European championships and been EuroLeague MVP. But they didn't talk about that. They said Anthony Parker, Eza Mensch, Eza Motek, Eza Ziskite. They really loved him, and they talked about him like he was their own grandson. And I was really struck by it. I knew Israel had a professional basketball league. I knew there were pretty good players there. I knew there were African Americans there. I had no sense of how big a deal it was. And I certainly had no sense of the level of connection between Israeli fans and players there, to the point that they'd know what the player was doing years later and speak about him so highly.
That's absolutely incredible that the fans developed that connection. But let's talk about the connection that players develop with the state of Israel. First off, one of the other stories, having spent time in the South, was Joe Dawson. His Southern charm, as you call it, clashing with Israeli culture. Tell us a little bit about that.
Joe's was a fascinating story. And, really what I found when I started looking at this phenomenon, I had that interaction with my grandmother's friends. I looked into basketball in Israel and African-American players in Israel. And what I found was it wasn't just Anthony Parker. It wasn't just players on Maccabi Tel Aviv, the best team in Israel. It was hundreds of players who'd been to Israel, more than 800 African-American players in more than 40 years. And the book is about the phenomenon as a whole. And it includes players like Parker, who became NBA players, and players like Joe Dawson, who you mentioned, who wasn't an NBA player, didn't play at a huge college program, and yet ended up playing professionally overseas. And, some of the players were from big cities and lived in big cities. And some of them, like Dawson, were Southern players who experienced a really interesting bit of culture shock, because as anyone who's been to Israel will know, Israelis are extremely warm, extremely friendly. And as part of that, there's also a little bit of, at times, of intrusiveness. There's not as much personal space as people might be used to in North America. And Dawson was a player who spoke about his Southern manners and his Southern hospitality, and that being a bit of a challenge to transition. Interestingly, I spoke to another player, Fred Campbell, also from the South, who talks about having to change over his mentality from time to time Fred, like Dawson, is a player who actually played in Israel and stayed in Israel, became citizens and lived and stayed in the country after they retired. And Fred talks about very frequently having to change over from his American to his Israeli mentality and back, depending on where he is. And both of them were really unique examples of this extraordinary phenomenon.
Let's touch on something you just mentioned, staying in Israel. So a number of players, I was certainly surprised, have decided to stay, make Aliyah after their playing days are over. Some of them married Israelis or got into relationships with Israelis. Did that shock you during your research?
That was probably the biggest thing that surprised me. Again, I was familiar with there being a league. I was familiar with the quality. And once I had that interesting interaction about Anthony Parker, I thought the book would likely be about players whose experience were like his. Went, played in Israel, had a successful playing career, and ultimately, in his case, leveraged that to coming back to the NBA. Other players, I assumed, would go and play there and return to the U.S. eventually. And I was surprised at the level of the bond, the extent of the bond between fans and players, and the fact that, as you've mentioned, a number of players did stay. So there were players that married Israeli women and became citizens and stayed after they retired. Some players converted to Judaism and stayed after they retired. Some players, after they became citizens, actually served in the Israel Defense Forces and served in the military. There's players whose kids are now serving in the military. So this is a complete and total commitment in some cases, and in others, even those that did play and then return. It's a lifelong bond, and that's something I don't think I anticipated when I started doing the research all those years ago.
And it goes both ways. It's a lifelong bond from the players to Israel and also from Israelis to the players.
Certainly. And, I speak to a number of the players still, and they talk about, for some that are in the U.S., especially in some bigger cities, Drew Kennedy in Chicago and others, they'll be in a parking garage, they'll be in a restaurant, and they'll be approached by a fan who remembers something they did 20 or 30 years ago in Israel. And other players, and Alcy Perry is a player we were touching on just before we started. But, Alcy Perry was the first significant Israeli African-American player in Israel, helped lead Maccabi Tel Aviv to a historic EuroLeague championship or European championship. And this is a player who, at his peak, was an absolute superstar. He was in commercials. He dated a supermodel. He won a European championship. He was a big, big star. He ultimately struggled a little bit, fell into drugs, retired from the game, returned to the U.S., and actually was convicted of drug smuggling in the U.S. and spent a number of years in jail. And I spoke to him for the book and was kind of curious. I know you're beloved when you're up here and you were winning championships and in commercials and on TV. What did the Israeli fans treat you like, and what was the relationship like when you were, at your depths, when you were in prison, when you were, struggling as much as you did? And he said he was actually embraced. He felt embraced even more so. When Alcy was in prison in the U.S., he actually was approached by prison administration to send a message out to Israeli fans: stop sending so much fan mail, stop sending so many letters of support. We don't have the infrastructure for that kind of mail. We're not used to celebrities. So it really, truly was a lifelong bond. And when he did get out of prison, he didn't stay in the States. He did return to Israel, and he still lives there now, well into his 60s and early 70s as an Israeli. And it's a pretty remarkable connection.
That's incredible. Before I get into a little more of Alcy's story, because there's a connection between him and Maccabi Tel Aviv I want to touch on, tell us about the fandom. Tell us about the passion that these fans have for basketball.
Well, it comes up on the court. It comes up off the court. If you've been to Israel, if you're going to Israel, I'd strongly encourage you to try going to an Israeli league game or a EuroLeague game with an Israeli team in it. The fans are fanatic. Players compared it to the Cameron Crazies at Duke or some of the biggest college basketball fan bases. It can get much louder than an NBA arena. There's a ferocity and intensity to the fan base that's really extraordinary. and they really, really care about the game, and they want to know and learn and understand the game. So a lot of players talked about how valuable it was that basketball meant something. They didn't want to play in countries where if they had a bad game, no one would tell them about it. They wanted to hear about it. And so players talked about, again, being out and about in Israel and getting told if they'd had a rough game, what they could do to get better. And even some very high level players, NBA players, Will Bynum for one, said, at first it rubbed him a bit the wrong way. He doesn't want to hear from a fan what he could do better. But what he learned was they really love the game. They really know the game, and they truly mean well. And he came to enjoy it because they love the game to a similar degree that he did.
That's amazing. I've been to a Maccabi Tel Aviv game myself, and I can attest the atmosphere is crazy.
Yeah, there's really nothing like it. And it surprises you. And even some of the smaller gyms, they've got gyms with just a couple of thousand fans. And if you go see a game in Jerusalem, it is raucous. It's just crazy loud.
Now that you just brought up Jerusalem, so the natural transition is to former Maccabi Canada head coach or assistant coach, Amare Stoudemire. So tell us a little bit about Amare's journey from the NBA to Israel.
Amare's is a fascinating story because it started well before he ended up playing in Israel. It's as you mentioned. So Amare, very little was known about him as far as his faith and his background and his connection to Israel until he arrived there one summer visiting. The year he was a free agent, actually, and ended up signing in New York. And Amare went, and rumors came out Amare's Jewish, and then counter arguments that he isn't Jewish. He's just interested in Israel. But in any event, what became clear was Amare had a vested interest in studying and visiting Israel. And Amare had been raised as a Hebrew Israelite, which essentially is, and I'm not an expert in the area by any means, but there's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had 12 sons. One of those sons was Judah. Judah's descendants are the Jews, and Hebrew Israelites are descendants of other sons of Jacob, and that's why they practice many customs that are similar to Judaism or many customs of Judaism without technically, in most cases, being considered Jews. So that's how Amare was raised, practicing some elements of Judaism, some elements of Christianity. He visited back in 2010, he ended up going with Maccabi Canada as an assistant coach in a subsequent visit, and he ended up going more and more. And eventually, as his NBA playing career was reaching its end, he ended up investing in Hapoel Jerusalem, and then as a part owner, and then ultimately chose to play for Hapoel Jerusalem. And now, obviously, he's back as an assistant coach of the Brooklyn Nets. But Amare has studied and actually went through and completed an Orthodox conversion just in the last few months. So a really fascinating story to watch develop, and someone who has, again, a very strong bond with the country and is obviously the biggest name as far as American players to play in Israel.
He could be one of the ultimate examples of the term you call Israelification of foreigners.
Yeah, he adopts the country in a big way, and social media makes this such an interesting phenomenon to follow now, because anyone can just follow Amare on Instagram and see him walking the roads, him going to study, him going to synagogue, him going to the shuk, all those different elements. He really bought into living in and being an Israeli.
So I want to touch on two things now, because these players are playing in a foreign country. However Americanized Israel is, you have two sets. You have the players that are in Tel Aviv, which is the big city, and then you have the players that are playing in the north, in the south, in small towns, sometimes kibbutzim. So what was that like for these players? How did they adapt? How did they mold and blend into society?
It was one of the things that I felt very touched by, was hearing from players how they bonded with some of those other cities. And clearly Tel Aviv is considered the most glamorous or the most cosmopolitan, the most social. But Corey Carr was a great example. Corey Carr was a former NBA player who went and played in Israel and never actually played for Maccabi Tel Aviv. And he spent more than a decade as a player in Israel, remains there now as a coach after his retirement from playing. And Corey loved playing for the cities in the farthest north and the farthest south. And the reasoning was he saw those as the most embattled communities. Those are the communities that were facing the most inherent conflict because they're on the borders with enemy nations. They're facing the most attacks and rocket launches and so on. And so he saw an opportunity to give them a positive distraction, give them relief, something to enjoy, something to take their minds off some of the challenges. And so whereas he could have played in some of those bigger markets, he certainly had the pedigree as a player. His biggest career highlight in Israel was hitting a shot for Ashkelon, a city in the south of Israel that is considered the most important shot in their city's history. So, that was Corey's example. Drew Kennedy was a player who loved taking his bike into the kibbutz and the moshav and eating communal meals. So it was another way to embrace the full experience of living in Israel, not just the glamour of living in and being able to go to restaurants and bars in Tel Aviv, but there were players that experienced the full gamut of life in Israel.
And for a guy like Carr, how did he deal with, the mental obstacle and the physical obstacle of being in a city like Ashkelon? You're right on the border with Gaza. There's inherent dangers that you're just not used to coming from the States.
The players all went through very similar experiences. I interviewed more than 40 players for the book, and they really reported the same kind of arc as far as their experiences with safety in the country. And effectively, for most of them, the vast majority, it was reluctance to come, in some cases refusals to come for a few years because of what they thought would be violence and a feeling of insecurity and a lack of safety. Then they arrive and they're pleasantly surprised by how safe they actually feel. And then they become the veterans giving the advice to the young players not to worry. And for Carr and Kennedy and Parker and many of these others that spent multiple years in the country, that's really how they dealt with it. But the reality is violence or the specter of violence is part of life in Israel. And so these players did have, like Israelis do, many close calls. Donald Royal was a former NBA player who was in a shopping center when an elderly woman put a bag down and said something he didn't understand. And his Israeli friend grabbed his hand and ran out because the woman had said Al Akbar and left a bomb. There were near misses where, there were restaurants on Dizengoff where Fred Campbell and various other players would go once a week. And then the 1 week they didn't go, there'd be an attack. And so players lived with that. And it was, again, one of the things that touched me the most about doing the research for the book was, I asked each of them, why did you stay? Right? It's one thing when you feel particularly safe, but once you've had a close call, once you've had an incident, if you're Israeli, you live there, right? It's your fight. That's your country. If you're an African-American player in Israel, you can pick up the phone and go anywhere, call your agent, go home, go to Spain, go to France, whatever it is. And they didn't. And a lot of them told me very clearly they'd developed an affinity for the people, an affiliation with the country, an admiration for the fact that Israelis would not let violence affect their day-to-day, would not let violence scare them away from doing what they normally do and living their life. And they wanted to exhibit the same resilience, and they wanted to contribute to it. And they didn't want fans to show up at an Israeli league game and see 2/3 of a team or half of a team or just the Israeli players. They wanted them to show up and see the full team. And so they were in it with them. And that's something that really struck me and really stays with me today.
That's absolutely amazing. And full credit to every single one of those athletes who make the jump and who had that dedication to stay.
Yeah, I say it a lot and I truly mean it. I don't use the term hero lightly. But I don't hesitate to say that these players are heroes of the country, and what they contribute should be given all of the credit. And that's really the mission of the book, is to spread the word about the bond that they have with the country and the contributions that they make to it.
Yeah, very, very true. Another thing you touch on in the book is the discrepancies or other discrepancies in salaries between Maccabi Tel Aviv, and pretty much everywhere else. So tell us a little bit about that. And in using one of the analogies used often, David versus Goliath, Maccabi Tel Aviv is the Goliath in the room.
Yeah, it's an interesting organization because they're the David when they play in Europe, and they're playing against CSKA Moscow and Real Madrid and those clubs, and they're the Goliath when they play in Israel. Maccabi Tel Aviv was the dominant team from the outset of Israeli basketball. They've been the most creative, they've been the most commercially minded, and they've got by far the most resources. So Maccabi Tel Aviv players over time, there have been Maccabi Tel Aviv players that have made $1 million or more per year. Generally speaking, their players tend to make in the hundreds of thousands and high hundreds of thousands. The average for an Israeli league foreign player is roughly in the 100,000 to 300,000 range. So it's a pretty substantial difference. There were players who talked about, especially in earlier years, there's more parity now, but in earlier years, coaches would go in and tell players, we've got to win the game before the Maccabi game because it's kind of a given that we're going to lose the Maccabi game. And at one point they won 23 consecutive Israeli league championships. But one of the interesting things I found in speaking to these African-American players was because they didn't grow up in a basketball society hearing about the dominance of Maccabi Tel Aviv, when they arrived in the country, they didn't really care that Maccabi had such a dominant history. And when I say that, I don't mean they didn't respect it. I mean, they wanted to beat them. And Corey Carr says, all the respect in the world to them, but I want to take it to them. And Fred Campbell spoke very proudly of, playing a game where against Maccabi Tel Aviv, where he was making $100,000 a year, and the center for Maccabi Tel Aviv was Victor Alexander, a former NBA player who was making $1 million a year, and Fred dominated him. And although they didn't win the game, he took it to Maccabi Tel Aviv's best player. So it's an interesting area where Maccabi's got all that history, but for these players coming in, they're competitors and they're there to win.
And to give Maccabi Tel Aviv some positive PR in this exercise, bringing it back to Alcy Perry, please tell us on the goodwill and what they did for him and how they stepped up for their players, former players at the time.
I dedicate a chapter to this in the book that, how do you deal with Maccabi Tel Aviv? And there are those that are fierce critics. And what I found was the organization had a lot more heart than their critics often gave them credit for. Alcy's was a great example. So Alcy, when Alcy played, Maccabi knew that he had a bit of an issue with discipline with his money, and they were concerned that what they paid him, he would squander. And so they actually negotiated into his agreement that part of his salary in lieu of salary would be put to buying an apartment in downtown Tel Aviv. And this is back in the 70s and early 80s. So you can imagine the increase in valuation since then. And so they negotiated that he would receive this apartment in lieu of some salary. He did. And then when he found himself in prison all those years later, he actually called a former Maccabi Tel Aviv teammate of his who was a lawyer in Israel and instructed him to sell the condo. And the lawyer, as he told me, for the first and only time in his life, purposefully ignored his client's advice. Maccabi Tel Aviv, who was a co-owner on the property or a signatory, and said, look, Alcy's instructed me to sell this condo. I don't think it's a good idea. I think whatever money he gets from it is not going to go to a good use. He might be being taken advantage of or whatever it might be. So I'd rather not sell the condo. What do you think? And Maccabi Tel Aviv basically said, we agree. We're not going to sign off on it. Shimon Mizrahi, the chairman, the legendary chairman, said, we're not going to sign off on it. And Alcy kept his condo. And it's something he thanks his former teammate for all the time now, because it's worth a substantial sum of money, and Alcy's financially secure because of it. So that was one thing. A number of his former teammates, and not just Maccabi Tel Aviv, but friends and people that he knew from Israel, when he did come back, bought a Burger Ranch franchise for him, the fast food chain in Israel, gave him a business to start managing. So he really was looked after. Will Bynum was a player who played decades later, and Bynum was involved in an altercation and actually was charged with a hit and run. And Maccabi Tel Aviv, again, could have cut him, could have replaced him with another foreign player, could have separated themselves or extricated themselves from the situation. And instead, not only did they support him, Shimon Mizrahi, the chairman of Maccabi Tel Aviv, who is also by chance a personal injury lawyer, actually represented him in court and had him cleared of the charges. So there were a number of examples of them doing very well by people, being very respectful and considerate. And I ended up taking a very positive view.
That's amazing. And these are some stories that, maybe it's the Israeli connection, but you just don't perceive, professional franchises in North America to take this interest in their former players.
Yeah, there's certainly a degree of personal connection that it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine the only NBA team, representing one of their players in court. It's, that level of bond really is something that seems particularly Israeli.
So all the athletes we're talking about are foreign-born players, and from what I read in the book, the rules change on a daily basis for how many foreign-born players and how the teams skirt the rules. So what's the status of the league today with the amount of foreign-born players let into the country, and are teams still trying to skirt the rules?
It's an ongoing change. It's funny, in the multiple drafts of the book over the years, I kept having to change the section where I talked about how foreigners were dealt with by the rules. And I ultimately went with what I'll tell you today, which is the rules are changing all the time. And they're trying to find a balance, and it's something I dedicate a fair bit of time to in the book. The balance between, you bring in foreign players and you're bringing in elite players that can raise the level of play, that can help teach your young players to become better, to work harder, to hone their skills. But if you bring in too many foreign players, the counter argument is, well, now your young local players don't get playing time, don't get minutes, don't get shot attempts, and it can stunt their development. And so how do you find that compromise? And the Israeli league has, at the outset, you could only use foreign players in European competition, and the Israeli league was just for Israelis. Then they allowed one foreign player, then two. And then eventually it got to too many. They restricted you to 4 foreign players. Then it was unrestricted number of foreign players. You had to have 2 Israeli players on the court at the same time. So they're constantly changing. It's constantly a source of friction. And like other leagues in Europe, they're trying to find their balance.
But as we've seen recently, Omri Caspi, who's now with Maccabi Tel Aviv, but also the recent draft, Deni Avdia and Ben Madar, Israeli talent is really trying to break through.
It's an incredible era for Israeli basketball, and Omri was a great interview for the book, because there were so many arguments on both sides of, do these foreign players help develop young Israelis? Do they hinder? And I was really curious to hear his perspective, and he was very clear. He learned more about hard work and dedication from African-American players, from Anthony Parker, Marcus Fizer, and so on, who played for Maccabi when he was coming up. And he really learned and pointed to them as sources of that hard work and that dedication. And it goes to a point that a couple of different players made to me, which is, when you're a young Israeli player, basketball is a game. It's a fun activity. It's a distraction. When you're an African-American player who's in Israel, you're there because it's your vocation, it's your job. And it comes with a level of hard work and dedication that might not be exhibited domestically. So Omri learned a lot. And now, as you've said, I haven't had a chance to speak to them, but, 2 NBA draft picks, including a lottery pick in Deni Avdia, an extraordinary achievement. Israel won the I forget if it was under 19 or under 20 European championship. So they're having some success at the national team level. And a small wrinkle. So Deni Avdia was picked 9th by the Washington Wizards. One of the scouts on the Washington Wizards is Drew Kennedy, who's featured prominently in the book, who spent more than a decade in Israel, the most years in Israel by a foreign player. And one of their assistant coaches, Corey Gaines, also spent multiple years in Israel and raves about his time there. So when he arrives, there will actually be a couple of retired African American players with connections to Israel in the payroll at the Washington Wizards.
That's what we call extended Jewish geography.
Exactly. It's a small world.
So you mentioned what Omri and Israeli-born players learned from the foreign-born. What did the African-American players, the foreign-born players that come to Israel, learn from the Israelis and their teammates?
You know, I can't tell you how many players talk to me about Shabbat and the impact that observing Shabbat had on them. Whether or not these players converted to Judaism, whether or not they became citizens, they talked about the idea that no matter how busy one becomes, no matter how frantic one's week has been, the fact that an entire country will stop and on Friday afternoon everything closes and kids will drive, hours to go see their family and break bread, have a dinner, talk about their week, spend that time together, electronics away, TVs off, and just spending time together. That was a really, really big one that a number of players talk about. And it's fascinating to hear years later that they still try to incorporate elements of that custom into their daily lives now, even if they're back in the US.
That's incredible. I would be remiss if we just take a moment. We just saw in the video the famous Tal Brody. If you can just talk for 2 minutes on Tal's impact, on how he changed the face of Israeli basketball for good.
Tal's a trailblazer. He took a leap. He went to play professionally in Israel when he was a first-round NBA draft pick, and quite literally changed the game. Israeli basketball was very slow-paced, walk it up, throw it into the big man, and Tal brought fast breaking. He brought hard work and dedication, and he made Maccabi into a winning team. And that European championship, when you think about beating CSKA Moscow, so it's 1977. Israel's just been through the Munich massacre in 72. The Yom Kippur War in 73, morale is low. The country needs a boost. And you've got this tiny Israeli team going up and playing CSKA Moscow, where they're literally funded by the USSR military. They don't recognize Israel's right to exist diplomatically. You can't play in Tel Aviv because the Russians refuse to go. You can't play in Moscow because they refuse to let the Israelis in. And you go and play in this tiny town in Virton, Belgium, and this Israeli team with some Israeli-born players, some American Jewish players, and Alcy Perry go and take on giant CSKA Moscow and actually win. And as you know, and again, as I'm sure your viewers have seen, but if you haven't, I encourage you to YouTube it. Tal Brody's interviewed after the game, and he says in Hebrew, "We're on the map, and we're staying on the map, not just in sports, but in everything." And you can't overstate how big a deal that was. At the time, Israel had one television station, so literally the country was tuned into this game, and it was an iconic moment. It was a rallying, unifying moment, whether you cared about basketball or not. This was Israel succeeding on the international stage in a way that did not involve military conflict, and it was just enormously significant. And of course, Tal, an alumnus of the Maccabi games, Willie Sims, an African-American player who played in the Maccabi games, another Hebrew Israelite, similar to Amari Stoudemire, who became a citizen of Israel. David Blue played at University of Southern California, was had a black parent and a Jewish parent, and played in the Maccabi game. So there's a very strong tie between the Maccabi games in particular and the phenomenon of African-American players in Israel.
Well, Maccabi Canada loves to hear that.
Thought you might.
I'd also be remiss if I didn't note that after that victory by Maccabi Tel Aviv, it started a string of success that rivals my Montreal Canadiens.
It does. 23 years in a row is something pretty amazing. And, and then was broken by Hapoel Galil Elyon, led by Drew Kennedy, one of the players we've been talking about tonight. So pretty amazing organization, and pretty extraordinary, and still a very successful organization today.
You also speak in the book a little bit about women's basketball in Israel and Simone Edwards and how big a celebrity she became in the country. So tell us a little bit about that and her story.
Yeah, it was really interesting to speak to some of the women's players. They basically said that similar to other countries, they don't quite make as much as the American players, and sometimes their fame is a little bit more local than national. But the women's players loved playing in Israel as well. And one of the really interesting elements was the city of Ramla. So Ramla is less glamorous than Tel Aviv. It's one of the countries that some of the male players don't really want to go to. It's a little bit less cosmopolitan, a bit more country, as one player described it. And so they struggled to get the best players to come and play there on the men's side. And so what they did essentially was they took their first division men's team and shuttered it, made it a second division team, and got to put that money into trying to build a world-class women's team. And they did, and they actually built the European champions as a women's team, and those women became just hugely popular. And also interestingly, the women's players in Israel are actually better relative to the men because the Israeli season doesn't conflict with the WNBA. So you've actually got WNBA players in their prime also playing in Israel. So Simone Edwards was one. Alicia Clark recently just did the same kind of double, played in Israel, won a WNBA championship. So these are the very, very best women's players in the world who, in between WNBA seasons, are off plying their trade in Israel. And again, going to the restaurants, going to the bar, museums. Alicia Clark, who I just mentioned, who won a WNBA championship, got choked up telling me about going to the Western Wall and the overwhelming feeling of walking in and just seeing it and understanding at that point why they called it the Wailing Wall, because she did just start crying right away. So it was another unique wrinkle to an already pretty extraordinary phenomenon.
All amazing stories. And once again, I encourage everyone to check out the book wherever good books are sold. Aliyah to Aliyah, African American Hoopsters in the Holy Land. David, I know we're running short on time, so a few more questions for you. Talk to me about the future of the game in Israel. You mentioned how the youth are having some success in the under-19 championship. What about in terms of the men's national team and, of course, the youth younger than that?
It's a popular game that's increasing in popularity. Omri Caspi was a big first step. Gal Meckel played a little bit in the NBA, and now you've got 2 draft picks, including a lottery pick. So there's some extraordinary momentum. Another unique wrinkle to this story is that a number of the African-American players that I spoke to for the book, their sons are now playing at a very high level. So the book features Mark Brisker. His son Michael is now playing professionally in Israel and representing Israel on the national team. Derek Sharp is a Maccabi Tel Aviv legend whose son DJ is playing. Sean Dawson, Joe Dawson, you asked about early on. Sean Dawson is a top league player in Spain, the best league outside of the NBA in the world. And so there's a lot of young talent. There's a lot of hope and optimism. And it's always encouraging to see. Just recently, they went, I believe, 4-0 in an international qualifying tournament, including beating Spain. So there's a lot of positive momentum and a lot of excitement, and hopefully, in future years, we'll be able to talk about Olympic success in addition to U20 and U19.
We'd all love to hear that. Before I get into a question about you, I just want to touch on also a very current subject. You mentioned this issue of race and these players coming to Israel as foreign-born players. Can you tell us about how they dealt with that and if there were any challenges for these African-American players in Israel?
Sure. It was really important to me that this be as accurate and thorough a book as possible. And I interviewed more than 40 players. I asked all of them whether or not they had experienced racism in Israel, and the vast majority said they did not. And I asked them if they knew of people, of African-American players who'd experienced racism in Israel, and the vast majority said they did not. And so that was the experience for quite a number. But the book is not a fairy tale. It's a very true story, and there were exceptions to that, and it was important to me to discover those to the extent they existed. So, there were instances of racism. There was a coach who made a speech about leadership, and in trying to make a joke, or allegedly trying to make a joke, made some inappropriate and racially insensitive comments. There were some players who felt that after they retired from playing, that there was a bit of a glass ceiling as far as getting into coaching for African-American players who wanted to transition to coaching. There was one incident of Willie Sims, again, a Maccabi Games alumnus who played for 15 plus years in Israel, became a citizen, and was actually mistaken for an illegal Sudanese migrant, and was a police officer, an undercover police officer, thought he was trying to break into his own car. He actually locked his keys in his car. So there were exceptions, and it was important for me to examine those. But it's also important to consider the context. And the question for me was not, is there racism in Israel? Of course, right? It's a country. There's millions of people there. There's going to be negative instances. It's how did the treatment of these players in Israel on the basis of their race compare with anywhere else in the world? And that's where it was extraordinarily positive. Even Willie Sims, I asked him about the incident with police, and I asked him if it made him want to return to the U.S. And he said, if I'd been in the U.S., I could have been shot. And so there was actually a thankfulness that it happened in Israel and not somewhere else. So, were there exceptions? Absolutely. Do those exceptions negate the overall positivity of the phenomenon and positivity of African-American players' treatment in Israel on the basis of race? It didn't. It truly was a positive phenomenon for them.
Incredible. Such fascinating stories. And I'm now getting to you a little bit because you're telling too much and I want people to buy the book. I don't want you to just recount the whole story for them today. So the book took you over a decade to write. It couldn't have been easy, and it also couldn't have been an easy sell for publishers. Tell us a little bit about that for aspiring authors watching.
Sure. When I started, I was just curious and I wanted to learn. And so I didn't, as many authors traditionally will go and find a literary agent first with nothing but an idea or a book proposal. So they'll explain the topic, maybe they'll write a sample chapter, but they'll outline kind of, here's what I'm intending to do, are you in? I didn't want to do that. I didn't know what I had. I wanted to research exhaustively. I wanted to be confident before I asked someone to vouch for me, that I was willing to vouch for myself, that I had really a great story to tell. And so I was a lawyer at the time, and I did a few years of researching, interviewing, working on drafts. And after about 4 or 5 years, I had a draft that I was ready and confident this was a great story and it was worth telling. And I started reaching out to literary agents. And for those of you that aren't familiar all that much with the industry, for a publisher, they would get inundated with requests from authors to publish their books. So traditional publishers only listen to pitches from agents. So agents are the ones that get the thousands of emails a day. And I was one of the people adding to their workload. I sent emails to agents and ended up at one point 0 for 180 on literary agents before I found someone who's willing to take on the book. And I found an exceptional agent out of New York who saw what I saw, who had the vision that I had. And he spent almost 3 years getting rejected by publishers, and ultimately found an extraordinary publisher in New York that specializes in their own words, they said they specialize in an eclectic group of titles that other publishers just don't know what to do with. And that's really what I had. I had a story that, many people told me, you've got the book publishing, you've got the book buying world. Now you're narrowing it to people that love basketball. Now they also have to love Israel. Now they also have to be interested in race relations. You're carving it a little too thin. And there's nothing like it. There's no other stories like this that have been published. And my argument was, you could be interested in any of those things, and you will be interested, or you could be interested in this unique look at, or unique perspective at it. So you don't have to love basketball to love this book. In fact, there's very little about the games themselves in it. If you're interested in a unique look at the state of Israel, how about looking at it through the eyes of African-American basketball players? Or you could be interested in basketball and just want to read a book about basketball that doesn't center around the NBA, and you might be interested in this book. So ultimately found an agent and a publisher that shared that view. And I'm grateful for all of those years, including the years of rejection, because they allowed me to get closer with the players. They allowed me to see their circumstances change, watch as stars become veterans, become ultimately retired players, see their kids grow up. There were players that told me about their kids when they were toddlers or quite young. And then by the time the book got published, they're telling me what it's like to send them off into the IDF. And so really all of that time was extraordinarily valuable. It was certainly a passion project, and I'm just beyond thrilled that it exists. That was my first big I can't believe it moment when it physically existed in my hand. And now to you, Daniel, and to your viewers, that there are people that share my interest in it and want to learn more about it. It's a continuing, ongoing thrill.
That's an incredible story, and I thank you for taking that journey, because it was an incredible read. I absolutely loved it. For everyone watching, the book is called Aliyah to Aliyah, African American Hoopsters in the Holy Land, available at aliyahtoaliyah.com, as well as Amazon and wherever great books are sold. And I have it on good authority that it's Alan Dershowitz's favorite book.
That was a treat. So appreciate the time. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you so much for your time. Happy Hanukkah to everyone. Once again, this book makes a great Hanukkah present. And please tune in next week for the season finale of Frontline Access, when we bring in Arik Zevi, Olympic medalist, 4-time Olympian, and the chairman of the 2022 Maccabiah Games.